So the talk I'm here to give to you today is Only the Learning Survive. It's essentially about how the rapid economic transformations that we are undergoing right now and that we will be increasingly going into at a faster pace require that we all learn all the time. And if you can kind of accept this as a fundamental truth, as an individual, as a family, as a neighborhood, as a society, as an island nation in the Mediterranean, you'll probably be good and positioned for the coming economy and economic change. And if not, there are certainly risks, right? So I like this quote because it kind of simplifies things. Mark Andreessen said, "The spread of computers and the internet will put jobs in two categories: people who tell computers what to do and people who get told by computers what to do." You know, even I'm not sure which of those jobs is better. I'd personally prefer the first one. But the point is that all jobs in the future will be interacting with technology. I had a friend who was starting a new kind of bank about 5 years ago. This is an organization called Stripe, which is now one of the biggest and hottest startups in Silicon Valley. And he said, I know that the finance sector is important in Malta, so this is why I bring it up. He said, "I think all banks are technology companies and they don't know it yet. And so if I start a technology company today that goes after banking, I'm bound to win." So as an example there. A little bit more about me. So I'm here to kind of share my perspective and journey with you. I actually started as a classroom teacher, doing very analog things with analog people, analog little humans. On any given day, I reached about 150 students. I did as good of a job as I could. Sometimes we had fun, sometimes we learned a lot. Learn Capital has been operational for about 9 years, and we're reaching about 300 million learners through our technology portfolio. So there's a difference between the kind of scale of using digital technologies and using the analog ones. I've been a serial edtech entrepreneur for the past decade, and Learn Capital has about 220 million under management and has a portfolio of over 75 companies. Okay. So part of my experience in joining Learn Capital is I joined kind of right after the recession of 2007 to 2009, and I noticed the impact of young people. I have a younger sister. I kind of experienced this as well, but there's a new phenomenon we're calling the lost decade, which is essentially people in their 20s. People in their 20s are taking longer to get their footing in the economy, to figure out what they want to do. They spend time kind of drifting around, sometimes living at home, and this is becoming a global phenomenon. And I think, statistically speaking, in Southern Europe, it's a big phenomenon. And part of the reason this happened is that when companies were shocked by the recession, they kind of got a little bit more firmly committed to the idea that the relationship between a company and employees needs to change. In particular, we've got to put the company first, not the employees first, and we need to look at how to avoid long-term contracts and long-term deployment agreements and long-term benefits, and redesign the company so that it can be more flexible, more agile, and leverage things like on-demand talent, contingency workforces, outsourced labor. But the consequence of that is right now there's kind of a battle going on between what should we expect from our companies and what should we expect from our governments, and what can governments expect from companies in terms of long-term commitments and benefits. And this is the kind of conversation where I think if regulatory frameworks come out of it and understand how to do big compromises, I think that that'll position whatever country manages to figure that out in a really good place. So the industrial transformation that we've been a part of is this rise of computing, right? And in every kind of industrial revolution, whether it was steam, electricity, or computing, there's a momentary shock where everything feels crazy, and then about 20 to 50 years later, everybody kind of adjusts and the economy resettles, and we're all really excited that we didn't have to do that work that other people had to do 50 years ago. And with every single one of these industrial revolutions, you had naysayers that were saying things like David Ricardo in 1821, the substitution of machinery for human labor is often very injurious to the interests of the class of laborers. So we've been having this debate for a long time, and you can find a lot of people now that are predicting that essentially AI is going to eat your job, essentially, or the robots will eat your job. And there's some truth to that, and it's helpful to be aware of that. If you remember Mark Andreessen's statement of the two types of jobs, right? You're either telling computers what to do or you're getting told by computers what to do, which is there's a recursive process where humans write better software, they build new hardware which can support new software, and then you think up new software to write. And we're getting into the cycle, and more people are participating in this cycle, especially in a place like Silicon Valley. And this is creating a whole lot of economic opportunities, but the only people that can take advantage of it know how to tell computers what to do, essentially. And all around the world, this is just in the US alone, we're predicting a shortage of 1 million software engineers. And one of the companies that I helped start, Dev Bootcamp, was like a 12-week program where afterwards you could get a job as a software engineer, and those have become very popular around the world. So with this rise of AI, like, is the threat this time real? Is the threat from robots real? If you look at some of the economists and the people that are speculating about this, you have numbers like 45 million jobs will disappear by 2025, so that's like 7 years from now, so that could be very real. And you already see this chart at the bottom here, basically like the percentage of time people spend at work is now already dominated by non-routine cognitive work. And when I said earlier, like the future of work will be learning, that's because basically anything routine that doesn't require learning will be automated or roboticized, and the only work left to do will be figuring out what the robot should be doing, or what the machine should be doing. And the process of figuring that out, the process of designing it, is often involving research, learning new skills, going through design processes, etc. And that requires essentially learning all the time. So I think we're moving from a model of work where you do your work and then at some point maybe you have a learning opportunity to reskill, like in your spare time, maybe you go to night class, to where all you'll be doing on the job all day is learning. Another thing to think about job creation, almost all job creation is done by startups. So the statistics here is that net job creation comes from companies that are less than 5 years old. Basically, if a company's been around for more than 5 years, on average, they don't hire more people. If you look at how automation and robots come into being, I think that there's this silly idea that you're going to be doing work, you're going to be like washing dishes, and then one day there's going to be a robot next to you washing dishes that like takes your job. And that's not actually what it looks like. What it looks like is a company called Facebook gets to $8 billion in revenue in 2013, having 15 times less employees than Kodak when they hit that same amount in 1962. And so if you can build a company that taps into revenue with 15 times fewer people, that's what automation looks like. It looks like very, very lean companies. And one of the concerning things is actually the rate of startup creation has been going down. So if you need 15 times fewer people, if you want to have everybody be employed, you need 15 times more startups to have everybody employed. So one of the things that we need to be thinking about as a society, and you guys are thinking about here at ZEST, is how do you actually increase the rate of entrepreneurship? How do you increase the number of startups? And then also be asking your question, what comes after jobs, right? I'm kind of being redundant here, but basically, work will only exist as learning and problem solving. I think that the future of work is learning. And by the way, the idea of a job is pretty new anyway. We don't need to be that attached to it. It's just a human construction we came up with about 100 years ago. So in the past, when these economic shifts happen, education has really been the only answer. There's an economist that works with us, a Stanford economist named Eric Hanishek, and he's basically demonstrated that if you can improve actual learning in school, that subsequently over the next 20 years, your GDP will grow by a substantial amount. And so he did a report for Mexico where he said essentially if you can increase the performance on your PISA score, we estimate that the value you will unlock over the next 50 years is 26 trillion in GDP. You guys have probably know the case study of South Korea, Singapore. The thing that they both have in common is they decided somewhere around 1960 that they actually didn't really have the kind of natural resources or natural assets that allowed them to say, oh, you know, we'll be fine, our society will be prosperous because we have, you know, a great climate or a great wine industry or whatever. They had nothing. They're like, all we have is our people, and so we have to be dedicated to developing our human capital. And both locations, both governments took that extremely seriously. They invested over 20% of their annual budgets into education and learning opportunities. And if you just look, I guess in Korea, you know, in 1960, their per capita GDP was less $2,500, and in 2017, it's almost 30K. So this economic shift is happening. We talked about the fact that companies require fewer workers to do more work or create more output. The good news is, globally speaking, entrepreneurs are on the rise. Even though the data on company formation is not that great at the moment. But just in education technology, when we got started in 2008, there were 80 companies around the world that had some kind of financial backing. Now last year, 2016, there's over 2,500 startups that have some kind of funding globally. And they're going after this enormous market called education. It's the third largest sector on the planet. It's been totally untouched by essentially like, what would you call it, market-based solutions, though you might find some people that have been doing that in the past. And as a result, the market capitalization of companies in this sector is far below what you see in other sectors. And actually, if you look at healthcare, 40 years ago, healthcare actually looked very similar. And what happened was a few regulatory shifts, a few technology shifts, the rise of biotech and pharmaceuticals, and then suddenly you have massive value for investors that have participated in healthcare. And we anticipate the same thing for education. So we look for transformative enterprises. Again, we backed about 75 companies, but I'll talk a little bit about these three. So Coursera takes the best university courses from the best universities in the world and puts it online for free. And you can go through credentialing programs. You can get a certification, or I think it's called signature track, and then you can go through what is essentially a major at one of these great universities for like somewhere between $300 and $500, which is basically 100x lower cost of getting a university degree. Bridge International Academies, they operate in East Africa, where teacher absenteeism is roughly 50%, meaning about 50% of the time the teacher's not even in the classroom. They've gotten their teacher absenteeism down to less than 0.5%, which is a 100x improvement. And then General Assembly has programs at essentially 10 times lower cost and 16 less time than professional degrees that help you reposition for a new job. So the secret is in actually the boring stuff, which is, this is like a Boston Consulting Group way of thinking about businesses, right? A lot of times in education, people only think about quality. They only think about basically, is the experience that I have learning, is the learning that I'm getting the best learning I can get a hold of? And often the magic is actually in the back office of how these startups are configuring their companies. What are their processes in place? How do they employ people? What do those people that are employed do? And they come up with essentially sometimes maybe less than an equivalent status quo organization for a brief minute, but once they get going, they can provide the same quality at a radically lower cost. And this is an example of kind of different configurations. So, you know, Amazon is a retail brand that has a radically different configuration than incumbent retail chains. And you can just look from 2010 to 2017, Amazon's growth versus incumbent retail. And actually, if you look at their equity value, incumbent retail is on the way down. You can look at the same thing in Kodak versus Instagram, where essentially Instagram, when it was acquired, I think had 14 employees, and they were acquired for $1 billion. In 2013, they were processing more images than Kodak, and they had 0 of the cost structure. So this is, again, configuration at work. And this is how disruption happens. It doesn't happen because they can provide something at a higher quality. It happens because they get a foothold and can grow exponentially with a radically different cost structure. We'll skip this one. An important thing to know is that innovation is fractal. This is important to think about in education because in education we tend to think in these kind of legacy structures, and it takes us a while to kind of break our thinking and rethink what's possible. But you know, when I say invest in education, they're like, oh, like a college, like a for-profit college. You invest in a for-profit. No, that's not what we invest in. We look for much more fractal ideas. We look for places where the demands are breaking apart into little bitty pieces, and those are being well served. So just a human example, right? You know, what about the dad who has no idea what kind of constructive activities to do with their upset child market, right? You wouldn't think of that as like an education company, but that's a demand for a father that wants to do constructive educational activities with their child. Another one is dad who wants to impress his wife with how much he reads to their child market, right? So you get left alone with the child, you can read to them. This is like a Fitbit that counts the number of words that are spoken to the child. Anyway, the kinds of startups that we invest in are often doing these little pieces, and it's really helpful if you think about innovation as being fractal and demand as being fractal, because then you can start to think about just how many companies can find and exploit just how many opportunities that exist out there in the world. And you can think about the fact that innovation finds totally new markets, and then this kind of rise of AI and robots taking over all of our jobs seems a little bit less scary if we can think about how do we commit ourselves and our organizations and our communities to learning and adapting and being out in front of these trends. So I'll end with a quote from one of my first investors. His name is Sean Parker. He's also known for being a little out there. But anyway, he was retrospectively basically a co-founder of Facebook, which is where he made a lot of his money. And I remember he was being interviewed, and he said, "It's not that I saw the future any more clearly than anyone else. It's that I realized the extent to which it would be true and how rapidly it might be true, and I did something about it," right? And so one of the things that happens in these moments, we're going to learn about a lot of ways of thinking about the future, but unless you go back to your organizations, your communities, and your families, and you let that sink in and actually change the way that you're approaching things and change the way you behave, it's not going to be, you're not going to be finding the kind of opportunities that we hope you can find here at ZEST. So, thank you very much. My name is Michael. Thank you.